My son texted me, "I'd rather lose my mother than lose my wife." 3 days earlier, she had thrown me to the floor, dislocating my shoulder and cutting my face. He said nothing, so I said nothing, until his name vanished from the $12 million estate and 800-acre ranch. Then came the dinner invite. They smiled. I stayed silent. And when I didn't give in, she poured soup over my head. He grabbed my neck, slapped me, disowned me, and then the front door flew open. What kind of justice do you serve when your own son becomes your enemy? It happened on a Thursday, late dinner, my house, my table. I had baked cornbread, roasted a chicken, and set out fresh butter just the way Jared liked it when he was 10. It was supposed to be a family night. Nothing fancy, just something normal. I thought maybe we had calmed the waters. Maybe Fiona had settled down. Maybe I could let my guard down for once. She showed up in 4-inch heels and an off-shoulder dress, like it was a cocktail party. Jared followed, smiling like a man who didn't want to be caught. Not smiling. He handed me a bottle of wine I hadn't asked for, kissed my cheek, and asked if dinner was ready. We sat down. The air was stiff from the start. Fiona barely touched her plate, kept tapping her fork. Jared was too busy checking his phone every few seconds. I tried to keep it light, asked about the garden they'd said they were planting, mentioned a new book I'd finished. Nothing landed. Then Fiona pushed her plate away and leaned back. "Do you ever stop managing everything?" she said, almost like she was asking the weather report. My hand froze halfway to my glass. I set it down. I said I didn't understand. She laughed. Cold. "You run the house, the land, the wedding plans, even Jared's diet. It's exhausting just watching you pretend this is your kingdom." I looked at Jared. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at me. I tried to keep my voice level, told her this was still my home, and I had every right to offer what I thought was kind. Fiona smirked, picked up her wineglass. "You want kind?" she said. And then in one motion, she flung the entire glass of wine into my face. It soaked my blouse, stung my eyes. I gasped, reached for the napkin. The chair scraped behind me. I didn't even get to wipe my chin before I felt it. The slap, sharp, full palm, from Jared, my son. The same hand that used to hold my fingers crossing parking lots now swung against my cheek without a blink. "Stop," he said. "You're ruining everything." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood up, wine dripping off my jaw, and I left the room. I heard Fiona laughing behind me. Jared didn't follow. In the bathroom mirror, I looked older than I had that morning. The red flush on my cheek was rising. I cleaned myself in silence, not because I was afraid to speak, but because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been thrown at me. That night, the message came. I'd rather lose my mother than lose my wife. 10 words, one sentence, a scalpel. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, not thinking, just breathing. Then I opened the drawer beside me and took out the estate binder. One by one, I flipped through every page. The land, the trust, the pending transfers. Jared's name was on nearly every one, not yet finalized, still within reach. I closed the binder, stared at the cover, let the weight of it sit in my lap. I don't know what other mothers would do. I don't know if they'd forgive, or wait, or try again. But I had been slapped for the last time, and something inside me clicked into place. I wasn't going to be the kind of mother who begged to be loved. I was going to be the kind that couldn't be touched. And if you're listening, if you've ever been made to feel like an inconvenience in your own home, ask yourself this. How long will you sit at the table with people who already counted you out? Because that was the last night I let someone else define my worth, and the first night I remembered exactly who I was. The next morning, I got up at 5. My cheek was still warm from the slap, but I didn't look at it in the mirror. I didn't want to see what I already knew. I walked past the kitchen, didn't bother with coffee, and went straight into the storage room at the back of the house. That room hadn't changed in years. The same file cabinet, the same tin box with expired keys, dust on the corners of every shelf. I unlocked the second drawer, slid it open, and pulled out the black binder that held my entire estate plan. Thick, heavy, labelled in my handwriting. I brought it to the dining table, sat down where Jared usually sat. I flipped the cover and started going page by page. Land documents first, 800 acres, still titled under my name. Then the trusts, retirement funds, property tax records. Jared's name was printed beside the phrase, pending beneficiary. A few forms had been signed, but none of them had been filed with the county. I found the final transfer packet in a yellow folder near the back, still unsigned, still within my control. I closed the binder and left it on the table. For a few minutes, I just sat there, not thinking, not hesitating, just letting the quiet settle. Then I stood, picked up the landline, and called the one number I hadn't dialed in years. Jude Watkins answered on the second ring. He used to be the junior associate at my old law firm, back when my husband handled all the business. I remembered him being sharp, quiet, and just the right amount of cold. The kind of man who never repeated himself. Now he ran his own practice. I told him I needed to revise an estate immediately, not later, not next week, today. He didn't ask for reasons, just gave me a time. 10:15. I was there by 10 sharp. His office sat above a dentist's clinic. No receptionist, no music, just clean walls and a ticking clock. He opened the door himself. Still wore the same square glasses, still looked like a man who could destroy someone with 3 sentences and never raise his voice. I handed him the binder, didn't say much, just pointed at the flagged tabs and said I needed everything Jared's name was on to be either removed or frozen. He nodded, began flipping through. For the next half hour, he said almost nothing, just read, made marks in a notebook. Finally, he closed the binder, leaned back, and looked at me. "It's all yours," he said. "Every signature is you. Nothing's been filed, nothing's binding. We can pull it all back." I asked what the steps were. "Step 1, he said, revoke the transfer intentions in writing. Step 2, establish a protective clause against any future claims. Step 3, secure new beneficiary designations immediately." I told him to do all 3. He said he'd draft the documents before lunch. I left his office with a copy of the revocation letter in my bag and a strange calm in my chest. Back home, I didn't eat, didn't turn on the TV, just cleared the dining table and opened the binder again. I took out every page that had Jared's name and laid them flat across the table like a map of betrayal. Then I gathered them, sealed them in a new envelope, and wrote in thick black pen, "Void, not filed, do not process." I set it next to the fireplace. By 3 p.m., Jude had emailed me the first draft of the new documents. He titled the file Winslow Restatement Final. There was no version 1, no draft 2, just final. I printed the pages one by one, stacked them in a new folder, called the notary service to schedule a signing. They said they could come by at 6. At 6:05, a woman in a grey blazer stood in my living room with a clipboard. I signed every line without hesitation. She notarized, packed, and left in under 20 minutes. When the door closed, I sat back down at the table. The air felt different. Still. like the house had let out a long breath it had been holding. In the silence, I opened the envelope again, looked at the pages that used to mean legacy, family, future. I lit the corner of one with a match and dropped it into the fireplace, watched the names burn, watched the lines curl and disappear. It was not revenge, it was not rage, it was removal. There are moments when a woman sees her own name in a legal document and realizes she still owns everything that matters. That was the moment I stopped being a mother waiting for love and started being a woman reclaiming peace. By Saturday morning, everything had been signed, witnessed, notarized, and sealed. The new estate plan sat in a locked drawer in my study. Jared's name no longer existed on a single asset, not on the land, not on the house, not on the bank accounts or the vehicles. He wasn't just removed, he was erased. The quiet in the house didn't feel empty, it felt earned. I woke up before dawn, took the truck down to the gas station, filled the tank, and picked up the local paper. At the bottom of the front page, just beneath a blurb about a high school fundraiser, was the announcement I had sent 2 days earlier. Loretta Winslow, longtime resident of Green Hollow County and former U.S. Army nurse, has formally announced the establishment of the Winslow Foundation for Veterans and Women in Crisis. The foundation, funded with a $10 million estate donation, will support community programs across the Tri-County area. I read the paragraph twice, folded the paper, and placed it gently in the passenger seat. It was a small story, but it was enough. On the way back, I stopped by the church. The lot was empty except for Pastor Elgin's old truck parked out back. I knew he'd be there, like he always was on weekends before the crowd came. I didn't go inside, just sat in the cab, engine off, looking at the windows I had cleaned for years on Saturday mornings. There wasn't a single doubt in my chest. No fear, no second guessing. I had made peace with what I had done. It wasn't revenge, it was correction. Back at home, I watered the herbs on the kitchen windowsill, fed the dogs, and waited. By mid-afternoon, my phone lit up. It was Jared. I let it ring out. He called again 20 minutes later. I silenced it. At 5:42, a text came through. It said, "We saw the paper. Can we come over to talk?" I didn't reply. At 6:18, the gate camera triggered. The driveway filled with headlights. Jared's car. I stood at the sink, dried my hands. By the time I opened the front door, they were already walking up the steps. Fiona wore a pale green coat and heels that clicked like she wanted the ground to know she was there. Jared followed, a few steps behind, head down. Fiona was smiling when she said hello. Her voice had a sweetness in it that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't return it, just stepped back and let them in. We sat at the dining table. Same one where the slap had happened. I hadn't changed the chair arrangement. I wanted the memory to stay fresh. Fiona started with compliments, told me how generous the donation was, how inspiring, how proud the community must be. She said it with that syrupy tone people use when they're about to ask for something. Jared stayed quiet. Then came the pause, the pivot. Fiona leaned forward, elbows on the table, smile softening. She asked whether I had filed the donation formally yet, said there might still be a window to adjust some of the details, suggested that perhaps the foundation could be structured differently, that Jared could help manage it, that keeping it in the family might ensure the legacy stayed protected. I listened without blinking. Let her talk. When she finally stopped, I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, came back. I looked her in the eye and said, "No, it's done." The smile on her face cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but it was there. She blinked, leaned back, exhaled sharply through her nose, like she had been expecting a negotiation, not a wall. Jared finally spoke, said something about feeling left out, about wanting a chance to make things right. I said nothing. He said he was my only child, that this was our family legacy. I took another sip of water. Fiona's voice sharpened. She asked whether I had any idea what I had done to them, said I had embarrassed them, that I was acting irrationally, vindictively, that people would talk. I nodded. She stood up suddenly. Too fast. The chair screeched back. Then, in one motion, she picked up the soup bowl in front of her and flung it toward me. The broth hit my chest. Not hot, but wet enough to soak through the fabric. I stepped back. She was already yelling, something about betrayal, about respect, about how I had ruined everything. Jared grabbed my arm, told me to apologize. Apologize. I shook him off. He raised his hand again. That was when the front door opened. Ella stepped inside. She was holding her phone up, camera recording. She had been standing on the porch the whole time, said she had seen them pull up, said something didn't feel right. The minute she heard yelling, she hit record. Fiona froze. Jared stepped back. I asked Ella to call the police. She did, right there, on speaker. By the time the officers arrived, Fiona had calmed down enough to pretend it had been an accident. Jared tried to play mediator, said it was all a misunderstanding. But Ella handed over the video, and I showed them the bruise on my arm. Statements were taken, reports filed. They left in 2 separate cars. I locked the door behind them, cleaned the soup off the floor, changed my shirt. Then I went to my study, opened the folder labelled Final, and added one more note at the bottom of the trust agreement. No visitation under duress. No reinstatement under emotional pressure. No second chances. Because something irreversible had just happened. Not the soup, not the shouting, but the final confirmation that they never saw me as anything more than a gate to money, and that gate had just closed forever. The officers didn't leave quickly. They stayed in the living room for nearly an hour. One walked around the property with Ella to retrace what she had seen before she entered. The other asked me for a detailed statement. I gave it to him clearly, calmly, not a word more than needed. I wasn't trembling, I wasn't stuttering. The soup had dried across the front of my shirt, but I hadn't changed. I wanted the stain documented. Jared and Fiona had already been separated into different squad cars. Neither of them looked in my direction as they were taken out. Jared kept shaking his head. Fiona tried to speak, but the officer stopped her before she could say more than a few words. Ella handed over the video without hesitation. She stood beside me as we both watched the playback on her phone, the same footage now stored in official evidence. You could hear Fiona's voice spike. You could see the movement of her arm as the soup bowl flew. You could see Jared grabbing me. The sound of the slap wasn't loud, but it was there. The officer nodded, thanked her, and asked her to sign a witness statement. She did it without blinking. They gave me a card with the case number and the names of both officers. One of them assured me someone from Victim Support Services would follow up in a few days. I told him I wouldn't need that. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary, then nodded. After they left, the silence in the house was heavy, but clean. No echoes. No residue. I stood in the doorway for a long while, then finally closed it, turned the bolt, and leaned back against the wood. I didn't cry. Instead, I went to the study, opened the file labelled Legal Holds and Restrictions. Inside were forms I had prepared but never filed. clauses for emergency suspension of financial access, conditions for revoking power of attorney, all documents I had updated just weeks earlier with Jude in case the situation ever escalated. It had escalated. I picked up the phone and called Jude's emergency line, left a single sentence on the voicemail. The restriction protocols are active. Execute immediately. Then I went to the kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and waited. By morning, Jude had responded with confirmation. He had already submitted the revocation notices to the appropriate agencies. Power of attorney was officially void. Financial access from all linked accounts had been suspended. The estate accounts had been flagged with a no-contact clause for Jared or any known affiliates. The language was legal, cold, but to me, it felt like warmth. At 9:30, I drove to the courthouse. I didn't wear black. I didn't wear grey. I wore the navy blue blazer I had kept in plastic for a decade, the one I had used when attending my husband's final military hearing. I wore it like armor. The clerk at the counter gave me a number. I waited. When they called me, I stepped forward and filed a restraining order request against both Jared and Fiona. Not just physical, financial, and legal as well. I provided the case report, Ella's statement, the video clip, and the signed affidavit Jude had prepared that morning. By noon, the judge granted a temporary protective order with emergency provisions. They would not be allowed within 100 feet of my home. They could not contact me by any means. They were barred from setting foot on any property I owned. They were prohibited from filing motions or claims against the estate for the next 6 months. If they violated any part of the order, criminal penalties would apply. I signed the documents, stamped, filed, complete. Back home, I printed a copy of the court order and pinned it inside the cabinet door where I kept the sugar, a place I saw every morning, not to remind myself of fear, but to remind myself of completion. That evening, I heard a car outside, but the new security system had already flagged the plate. Jared's. It sent an automatic alert to the sheriff's department. Before I could even step out, I saw the patrol car roll in behind him. Jared left without saying a word. The deputy nodded at me as they passed. I didn't wave. I didn't open the door. Instead, I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the knife, and finished chopping carrots for a stew. Later that night, I updated the estate binder with a new clause. Section 7B, Irrevocable Disinheritance Based on Conduct. It included a description of the events, the police case number, and the phrase, "Any future attempt to appeal this removal will be met with legal opposition on behalf of the Foundation." The gate was now locked, not just with a key, but with proof. The next day, a reporter from the local paper called. She had seen the police report. She asked if I wanted to make a public statement. I declined. The article ran without my voice. It was titled, "Woman Donates Millions, Then Survives Assault from Family She Disinherited." People began whispering, some sympathetic, some judgmental. But none of them knew that I slept better that week than I had in a year. At night, the wind moved through the trees the same way it always had. The stars hung in the same quiet patterns. But inside, the air felt different. No more watching over my shoulder. No more checking bank balances for unexplained withdrawals. No more pretending. The house was mine again. Not just in title, but in spirit. And as I sat on the porch that Sunday, cup of coffee in hand, I watched the sun rise through the clearing without a single shadow behind me. 3 days after the police report, Jude sent me an email with a subject line that simply read, "You'll want to see this." Attached were 7 pages of court records, civil filings, all from another state, dated 4 years back. The plaintiff was a woman named Barbara Klein. The defendant was Fiona Ames, not yet Fiona Winslow. The documents detailed a financial dispute. Barbara, 78 at the time, had accused Fiona of convincing her to invest in a wellness business for elderly women. The venture never opened. The money, close to $100,000, was never recovered. Fiona had claimed it was lost in startup costs. When the court subpoenaed the receipts, the trail went cold. Barbara passed away during the case. No heirs pursued it. The judge dismissed the suit without resolution. Jude had dug it up after requesting an interstate character check. He said it wasn't hard to find once he knew where to look. Fiona had left just enough traces. Enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. I printed the file and stapled it together. It was heavy in the hand, not in weight, but in implication. That same afternoon, a name surfaced in my memory. Clara Monroe, my late sister's friend. She had once mentioned something about a cousin who lost money in a boutique startup in Jacksonville. I wasn't sure if it was relevant, but something about the way she had told the story had felt unfinished. I called Clara. She answered after 3 rings. I told her I needed a name, if she still had it. She hesitated at first. Then she said, "Derek Lawson." I remembered the name the moment she spoke it. Jared had mentioned a Derek once, in passing. Said Fiona's last relationship ended badly, but that the man had been obsessed with her, that he had been unstable. I asked Clara if she had any contact for him. She said no, but she remembered where he had worked, a hardware chain in northern Florida. I spent the next hour calling every store in the area until someone recognized the name. They said he no longer worked there, but they had a forwarding number. I took it, called, left a message. Derek returned the call the next morning. His voice was steady, measured. He asked who I was. I told him plainly, gave him the names. Jared, Fiona, my own. There was a long pause on the other end. Then he said he had been waiting years for someone to ask. We spoke for over 40 minutes. Derek told me everything. He and Fiona had met through a mutual friend. Things had moved fast. She was charming, motivated, spoke about wanting to build a business. Said she just needed a partner who believed in her. Derek had opened joint accounts, co-signed a car, paid the deposit on a boutique space downtown. The permits never came through. The space stayed empty. The money disappeared. 3 months before the wedding, he found out she had been in contact with another man, an older relative of a family friend. Wealthy, recently widowed. When he confronted Fiona, she didn't deny it. She packed her things, left the house, and blocked his number. Within weeks, she had moved across state lines. Derek never heard from her again. Until now. I asked if he would be willing to put this in writing, not for court, for clarity. He said he already had. Sent me a scanned statement that night, signed, dated, 3 pages long. I filed it with the other documents. I didn't call Jared, I didn't send a message. Instead, I began preparing a folder. I labeled it Timeline of Events. Inside, I placed the court records from Barbara Klein's case, the scanned statement from Derek, and the police report from the dinner incident. I added the restraining order, the estate revocation letters, and copies of Fiona's previous address history that Jude had pulled. It wasn't just paperwork. It was proof. A full picture. By the weekend, the community had started whispering louder. The foundation announcement had brought attention. The police visit had brought speculation. Now the article was circulating in smaller papers and online forums. I kept quiet. But then, early Sunday morning, I received an envelope slid under my door. No return address. Inside was a letter. It wasn't signed, but I knew who had written it. The language, the guilt woven through every sentence. It was Jared. He wrote that he hadn't known about Fiona's past, that he had made mistakes, that he had been blinded, that he didn't know what to do now. He asked if I would meet him. Alone, I folded the letter, set it aside. Not because I was ignoring him, but because I needed time. Instead, I opened the back door, walked to the far corner of the property, the spot where the trees opened just enough to see the sunrise. I stood there for a while, letting the cold air move through me. Then I turned back and walked inside. I wasn't ready to see Jared. Not yet. There was still one piece missing, and I had a feeling it would find me soon. It was Tuesday afternoon when the call came. Jude's number lit up my phone, and I answered without hesitation. His voice was calm but tighter than usual. He said he had forwarded the documents I gave him to a contact in the editorial department of the Green Hollow Ledger. The woman, a senior reporter named Susan Mack, had called back within the hour. She wanted to meet. Not for a quote, not for a soundbite, for a full story. I didn't need to ask why. The materials spoke for themselves. We arranged to meet the next day at the diner on Main Street. It was early when I arrived. I chose a booth in the back, one that faced the door. The place was quiet. Just the scent of coffee and the occasional clink of a spoon against a mug. Susan walked in wearing a windbreaker and carrying a leather folio. She looked like someone who had read too much and slept too little. She introduced herself briefly, slid into the booth, and got right to it. No small talk. She had read everything. The court filings, Derek's letter, the restraining order, the financial records, the photo of the soup-stained blouse. She asked me if I wanted to go on record. I told her no. I wasn't interested in telling my side. I had already done what I needed to do. But I wouldn't stop her from printing what was already public. She nodded and said she would write the piece carefully. Then she asked one final question. She didn't ask it loudly. She didn't even look up from her notes when she said it. She wanted to know if I thought Jared knew what Fiona had done before me. I didn't answer right away. I stirred my tea, let the silence settle. Then I said this. I think he saw parts of her, but not the whole. I think he looked away from what was uncomfortable, and by the time it got ugly, it was easier to defend her than admit he had been wrong. Susan closed her notebook. That was all she needed. The article came out 2 days later. The headline read, "Foundation Benefactor Escapes Pattern of Financial Abuse." The article told the story plainly. It outlined Fiona's past, quoted Derek's statement, detailed the civil case with Barbara Klein, and listed the actions taken against Jared and Fiona in the past month. It referenced the restraining order, the revoked transfers, and the confirmed separation from the Winslow estate. It didn't include my name in the body of the article, only referred to me as a woman in her 70s with strong military and community ties. The piece spread quickly. It was picked up by a regional news site and shared on local forums. By the weekend, my mailbox was full of letters, some from strangers, others from people I hadn't heard from in years, women who had been through something similar, widows, mothers, sisters, even one from a retired teacher who said she had once taught Fiona in high school and had always gotten a strange feeling from her. I didn't reply to any of them, but I read each one. Jude called again the following Monday. He said Fiona's attorney had reached out, not officially but casually, testing the waters. He said she might be willing to settle the situation quietly, issue an apology, walk away without further dispute, provided I retract the estate block. I told Jude not to answer. 2 days later, I received a letter from the county district attorney's office. The battery charge had moved forward. Fiona was officially being prosecuted for assault and elder abuse. Jared, while not criminally charged, was now under a civil suit for coercion and unlawful interference with estate decisions. Jude had filed it on my behalf without needing my signature again. He already had full authorization. There was no drama in the delivery, no knocking on doors, no cameras, just paperwork. Stamped, filed, scheduled. I watched the machine begin to turn, not with revenge, but with certainty. Fiona's employer suspended her. Jared's position at the real estate firm he worked for was placed under review. The firm had strict policies around ethics, and his name was mentioned in multiple news pieces now, not as a victim, but as someone complicit. Their silence grew louder by the day. The last thing that came was a yellow envelope. It was from an anonymous sender, but I recognized the writing. Fiona's. Inside were 6 pages, handwritten, full of circular logic, accusations, claims that I had always looked down on her, that I had never given her a fair chance, that she had done what she had to do, that I had turned Jared against his own future. I didn't respond. I tucked the letter into a folder labeled miscellaneous, filed it in the back cabinet, behind the expired warranties and the tax records from a decade ago. That night, I slept through the windstorm that tore branches from the trees out front. The next morning, the sun rose over a quiet stretch of land. No knocks, no messages, just birdsong, coffee, and stillness. The tide had shifted, and I hadn't raised my voice once. The first real sign of collapse came on a Thursday. I wasn't looking for it. I had stopped checking. But while folding laundry, I received a message from a neighbor 2 streets over. It was just a photo. Jared's car, loaded with boxes, parked outside a rental duplex on the south end of town. The caption said, "I figured you'd want to know." I didn't reply. That same afternoon, the alert from the financial monitoring system came through. One of the old shared accounts between Jared and Fiona had been flagged for closure due to insufficient funds. Jude had installed the monitoring after we filed the estate restrictions. Not to pry, just to track any movement that could impact my name. Fiona's credit score had dropped 30 points in 3 weeks. Jared's was under review. The debt on their joint credit cards was growing. The house they rented had been listed online with photos from a mobile phone. Blurry shots of furniture posted with captions like lightly used and must go. The couch I had gifted Jared 2 years ago was one of them. I recognized the pattern. He had once said it reminded him of the lake house from his childhood. I sat with that photo longer than I meant to. By the following Tuesday, the story had reached his employer. The real estate firm put Jared on unpaid leave. They issued a public statement that their employees were expected to meet standards of conduct consistent with their mission. It was brief, but final. His name was no longer listed on the website by the end of the week. Fiona fared no better. Her suspension became termination. The agency that had hired her sent a letter to the county distancing themselves from her role in the foundation's controversy. She had spoken publicly once about her plans to build a women's empowerment retreat using what she called family connections. That clip had been shared in the follow-up article. It didn't age well. I did not celebrate. I did not comment. But the quiet around my property felt sharper now, as if the wind itself had less weight to carry. The garden, long left dormant, began to demand my attention again. I found myself spending more time there, trimming, watering, resetting the soil. The routines returned not because I needed to fill time, but because something in me had begun to clear. There was no more waiting, no more bracing. I no longer lived inside a question. Then, one evening just past dusk, a letter arrived without postage. No return address. It was left at the gate. I opened it on the porch. It was from Jared. The handwriting had changed, less confident, smaller. He wrote that Fiona had left. She packed 2 suitcases and said she needed space. He didn't know where she had gone, said she didn't take the dog, didn't say goodbye. He admitted he was staying in a furnished rental, said most of the things they once owned had been sold or returned. He said the silence in the apartment was unbearable. He said he missed the noise of the farm, the dogs, the humming of the kettle in the morning. He said he had read the article 3 times, that he believed every word, that it felt like reading about a version of his life he no longer recognized. He said he didn't want anything, not the money, not the land, not a second chance at inheritance. He said he just wanted to come by, not to talk, just to sit on the porch one last time. I didn't respond. I folded the letter, placed it in the file labeled personal correspondence, and left it there. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table. I thought of all the versions of Jared I had known. The boy with scraped knees who begged for another bedtime story, the young man who cried at his father's funeral, the adult who called every Sunday until Fiona said it was too much, the son who slapped my face and told me I was ruining everything. There are so many versions of people, but only one gets to stay. The next day, Jude called with an update. The civil case had reached a settlement offer. Fiona's legal team proposed a resolution to avoid court. It was weak, barely structured. It asked for my agreement not to pursue further action in exchange for a public apology and a sealed case. Jude asked what I wanted to do. I told him to reject it. There was nothing left to settle. I had already settled myself. And some things do not belong behind sealed files. They belong where others can see them, learn from them, be warned by them. That night, for the first time in months, I lit the small lamp in the guest room again. Not for a visitor, not in hope, but because it made the house feel complete again, whole, untouched, and still mine. It was a Thursday morning when the deputy called. His voice was calm, like it always had been. He said Jared had requested a supervised visit. Nothing formal, no legal obligation, just a single conversation. At the county station. 1 room, neutral ground, 10 minutes. He said it wouldn't be recorded, that it didn't have to be answered. I asked what time. He said 2 o'clock. I didn't dress up. I didn't prepare a speech. I wore my everyday jeans, a plain sweater, and my boots. I drove the truck into town, like I would have on any grocery run. The sky was overcast, the kind that made the colours of the fields look muted and dull. I parked behind the station, walked in without a word, and signed the clipboard the front desk handed me. A deputy escorted me through 2 doors and down a short hallway. The room at the end had no bars, no mirrors, just 2 chairs and a metal table. 1 small window, shuttered halfway. They let me in first, told me he'd be in shortly. I sat, back straight, hands folded in my lap. Jared entered 3 minutes later. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in height, in posture, shoulders drawn in, hair a little longer, shirt untucked. He sat across from me but didn't lean forward, just rested his hands on the table and looked down at them for a while. Then he raised his head. His voice was quiet. I almost didn't hear it the first time. He said he didn't know where to begin, that everything he thought he understood had cracked open, that he had spent weeks trying to figure out where it all started to fall apart. I didn't answer. He said he missed his old life. Not the money, not the plans, the rhythm, the feeling of knowing where he stood in a family that used to feel solid. He said he hadn't heard from Fiona in days, that he didn't expect to. Then he asked if I believed he had known everything she had done. I kept my gaze steady, let a long breath move through me before I spoke. I told him I didn't know what he had known. I only knew what he had chosen to ignore. That sometimes silence is a decision. That sometimes looking away is as loud as shouting. He didn't interrupt. He just sat with it. I told him I didn't come to offer a way back, that this meeting wasn't a door. It was a wall, a final point of clarity. He nodded, swallowed hard, said he understood. He said he had replayed that night over and over. The soup, the shouting, the slap. He said he didn't recognize himself in those moments. He said he couldn't believe what he had become. I told him it didn't matter if he believed it. It had happened. It was real. And real things have consequences. He dropped his head again. His hands gripped the edge of the table. He didn't cry, but his voice broke when he said he was sorry. I waited. He asked if I could ever forgive him. I looked him in the eyes and said one sentence, I already did. But that doesn't change what stays closed. He sat with that, no arguing, no begging. He nodded again, this time slower. Then the deputy knocked on the doorframe. 10 minutes were up. Jared stood. He didn't reach for a hug, didn't ask for more time. He just said thank you for coming. I stayed in my seat, watched him walk out. The door shut behind him with a soft click. On the way home, I didn't feel anger or grief. I felt the kind of tired that settles behind your bones, the kind that only comes when something that took years to stretch finally snaps clean. Back at the house, I made tea, sat by the window that overlooked the gravel road. The light shifted across the floor, long and slow. A breeze rolled through the open frame, just strong enough to rustle the curtains. The farm felt still, but not empty. Later that night, I went to the guest room, the one Jared used to sleep in. I opened the closet. Inside, a single wool coat still hung on the far hook. I touched the sleeve, then closed the door. Some things didn't need to be cleared out. They just needed to stay still. I didn't speak of the visit to anyone. Jude didn't ask. Ella didn't bring it up. And I didn't write it down, at least not in the legal sense. But that conversation lived in my memory, shelved next to every other moment that had shifted the path I walked on. That night, I locked the front door, took the long way upstairs, paused halfway to listen to the house breathe. No footsteps, no tension, only quiet, only mine. The week after that meeting passed without a ripple. No phone calls, no mail, no knocks on the door. Even the dogs seemed to sleep more soundly. The weather had turned too. The nights came sooner. The air was clearer in the mornings, a sign that summer had loosened its grip. Jude sent me a message that Monday. He said the press had reached out again. Not local this time. A regional feature writer was building a piece on elder exploitation and wanted to use my story. They had seen the Ledger's articles, followed the case, and wanted a first-hand account. Jude said it was my decision. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked outside and stood by the edge of the gravel road. There was no car coming, no sign of movement, just the sound of wind moving through the higher branches and the soft ticking of the fence gate swinging back and forth. For all the noise this story had stirred in other places, my land had remained still. That stillness had been earned, not inherited. No one gave me this quiet. I had cleared it myself, one decision at a time. I went back inside and called Jude. I told him to decline the interview. I didn't want my name in the center of any headline. The story had already spoken loudly enough. The facts were printed. The files were public. And those who needed to know had already seen it. I told him I wasn't disappearing. I was just done explaining. Later that day, a letter arrived. This one wasn't from Jared or Fiona. It came from the County Women's Outreach Centre. A councillor had read about the Winslow Foundation and wanted to send thanks. She included a list of programs that had launched using the first wave of donations: a support group for elder women facing domestic pressure, a transportation grant for mothers re-entering the workforce, and a monthly legal clinic for women over 60. She didn't ask for more, just wrote that the support was being felt, quietly, in rooms where healing happened. I folded the letter and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. That board had once held appointment reminders and grocery lists. Now it held pieces of something bigger, not headlines, not statements, just proof that something had moved forward. I thought of all the voices that had filled the past year: the shouting, the blaming, the rehearsed apologies, and I thought of how loud they had been and how little they had said. But silence, I had learned, could say everything. It became my final choice. That evening, I sat down at the old typewriter I had kept in the back closet. I dusted it off, rolled in a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write the one-page statement I had waited months to finish. Not for the papers, not for the courts, just for the record. I wrote that this house, this land, and every decision tied to it had been shaped by hands that refused to close in bitterness. That the legal actions were not acts of vengeance, but protection. That silence was not weakness, and restraint was not forgiveness. It was survival. I wrote that my name would not be used in a story where I had to argue for my own dignity, that my legacy was not a debate. It was a boundary. When I was done, I signed the page and filed it in the front of the Winslow Foundation binder. That binder sat on the shelf beside the family albums. I didn't move it to the safe. I wanted it visible, not guarded, just present. Days passed without updates. People stopped calling. The press turned to other stories. The air stayed quiet. I started waking earlier, not from tension, but from habit. I had no one to explain myself to anymore, no one to answer to, and that space, once filled with need, now held peace. One morning, I walked to the edge of the pasture, watched the fog roll back from the hills. The light touched the tips of the grass first, then moved slowly toward the house. I stood still until it reached my boots. I didn't think about Jared. I didn't wonder what Fiona was doing. I didn't relive the courtroom filings or the meetings or the letters. I just stood there, breathing in the weight of a name that had finally been returned to me. Not inherited, not borrowed, not threatened, just mine. That was the first day I no longer saw myself as someone recovering. That was the first day I felt finished, not broken, not repaired, just done and whole. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel slower. The light came in low through the kitchen window, brushing against the edge of the counter like it was unsure of its welcome. I stood there barefoot, waiting for the kettle to hiss, letting the quiet settle into my joints. No phone, no emails, just the tick of the wall clock and the warmth of the stove humming beneath it. The newspaper sat untouched. I had stopped reading it regularly, not out of spite, just because it no longer held anything that belonged to me. The stories had moved on, the names had changed. I had stepped out of the center of it, and the world hadn't noticed. That was the peace of it. After breakfast, I walked out to the far edge of the property. The path had grown wild again, weeds curling up around the stone steps, but I didn't trim them, letting them be felt right. At the end of the path stood the bench. It wasn't anything fancy, just two wooden planks and a frame my late husband had welded together one fall when he still believed in small projects. Jared helped paint it. I could still see the spot where his brush had missed the underside. I never fixed it. I sat down, my knees slow to bend, and let my eyes drift out across the line of trees. They had lost most of their leaves. Their shadows now sat in long, broken lines across the field. The wind was soft, just enough to move the dry grass in waves. That bench had held a lot. Arguments, anniversaries, even the silence after my husband passed. It was where Jared told me he had asked Fiona to marry him. It was also where I first felt something uneasy in her eyes when she smiled. It had taken years to name it. I reached into my pocket and unfolded a letter I had been carrying for a week. Not the ones from lawyers or reporters. This one was different. It was from a girl named Ruby. Handwritten, no stamps, just delivered through the foundation mailbox, tucked between a bundle of thank you notes from program directors and counselors. Her handwriting was careful. She introduced herself as a student at a youth centre, partially funded by the foundation. She said she liked painting and birds and math. But what caught me was the last part. She wrote that sometimes when people don't want you, it makes you think you are the problem. She said she had felt that way for a long time, until someone told her that sometimes people only love the version of you that helps them feel powerful. She said now she was learning how to like her quiet voice, that it didn't need to be loud to matter. She ended with one line: "Thank you for giving people like me a quiet place to grow." I folded the letter again, slipped it back into my coat. I sat on that bench for a long time, long enough to hear the shift of wind against metal, the slow creak of the fence gate in the distance. The past few months had come and gone like a storm I had walked through without running, and now all that was left was air and time. When I stood to leave, I didn't look back. Instead, I turned toward the garden. The soil had gone untouched for weeks. Weeds were curling around the corners. Some of the roots from the summer blooms had cracked open under early frost. Still, I knelt beside the edge and placed my palm flat against the dirt. Cold, dry, but not empty. I pulled on the gloves I kept near the shed and began clearing what no longer belonged. Old stems, rotten leaves, the remnants of things that had once been beautiful but were now spent. I worked slow, not out of fatigue, but out of focus. The act of clearing without rushing was something I hadn't known I missed. I didn't plant anything new. Not yet. The garden wasn't ready for something new, but it was clean again, open. That night, I brought out the small notebook I had used for years. It was worn, spine cracked, but the pages inside still crisp. I wrote one line at the top of a new page. Not every cycle ends in bloom. Some end in breath. Then I closed the book and slid it back into the drawer. Sleep came easier that night, not because everything was solved, but because I had stopped solving things that no longer asked to be fixed. There was no need for explanation, no space left for permission, and no part of me that felt like it owed anyone a version of myself I had already left behind. The next morning, I didn't wake with urgency. I let the light move first, and when it reached my face, I opened my eyes and simply began again. I knew what I was about to do would close a door forever. There would be no more hoping for apologies, no more glancing at my phone expecting a message that said, "Mum, I was wrong." No more waiting for a miracle to restore what had been shattered. But I wasn't looking for healing from them anymore. I had learned to stitch my own wounds in silence. The afternoon sun fell across the long wooden table at the lodge, where I had invited everyone. My attorney sat at one end, quiet, attentive, his briefcase unopened in front of him. The room smelled faintly of cedar and fresh bread. Outside, birds chirped like it was any other day. Inside, it was the prelude to war. Eli came first, alone. He wore a pressed shirt and a rehearsed smile that didn't reach his eyes. Marina followed a few minutes later, dressed like she was attending a victory party. Grant and his wife trailed behind them, Grant tapping furiously on his phone, clearly irritated to be summoned without explanation. No one greeted me. They simply took their seats, looked around, and waited. When everyone settled, I stood. I was wearing a simple navy dress, no jewelry. I had tied my hair back. My voice, when it came, was steady. I said, "Thank you for coming. What I'm about to share concerns the property, finances, and legacy of this family. You're here because I wanted you to hear it from me, not from an email, and not from a lawyer." There was a silence so dense it felt like the walls were holding their breath. I continued. For the last few months, I have been working with Mr. Kessler, my estate attorney, to restructure my entire financial plan. As of last week, everything has been finalized. Marina's posture shifted. Eli's brow furrowed. Grant looked up from his phone. I took a deep breath. The ranch has been donated. It now belongs to a trust I've created for women in rural communities who need shelter, job training, and a place to start over. The remaining funds from the estate, approximately $9 million, are being transferred to non-profit initiatives under that trust. No one spoke. They just blinked. I kept going. None of you are beneficiaries. This was not done out of spite, but out of clarity. I have given this more thought than you might imagine. I needed to ask myself who I became when I was around you, and I didn't like the answer. Eli stood up suddenly. "You're cutting us off," he said. "Just like that." "You cut yourselves off long ago," I replied. Grant scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You're giving away our inheritance to strangers." "No. I'm giving it to people who have never struck me, insulted me, or treated me like I was disposable." Marina slammed her hand on the table. "This is about that stupid dinner, isn't it? You're still punishing us." I looked at her. That dinner was the final note in a song you had been singing for years. Mr. Kessler cleared his throat softly. "If anyone would like to review the legal documents, I have copies." The room exploded into a mess of raised voices. Eli shouted that I was senile. Marina called me vindictive. Grant accused me of being manipulated. But I stood there, still and silent, like the storm outside a glass window. Finally, I said, "You made your choices, and now I've made mine." I turned to leave, but Eli stepped in front of me. "This is insane," he hissed. "We are your children." "Children don't betray their mothers and expect gifts in return," I said. Marina threw her napkin onto the table. "Let's go," she said. "This was a waste of time." Grant muttered something under his breath. Eli stood frozen for a moment, then followed them out. No one looked back. Mr. Kessler handed me a glass of water. "That went better than I expected," he said quietly. I laughed. A dry, hollow sound. I suppose it did. We sat in silence for a while. The birds kept singing outside. The sun kept moving. Eventually I stood, smoothed my dress, and picked up the folder Mr. Kessler had prepared. It held every signature, every clause, every protection I had fought for. I walked out into the bright afternoon, my shadow stretching long on the gravel path. I was alone, but not abandoned. I had chosen this path. I had written this ending, and it felt like the beginning. I walked out of that courthouse and felt the first clean breath in months. Not because I won anything, not because I came out victorious, but because I had chosen to end a war I never started. The building behind me held nothing of me anymore. My name had been untangled from every deed, trust, and legal loop they tried to twist around me, and more importantly, my heart was free from needing anyone's permission to matter. Outside, Martina waited in the same spot she had stood for weeks, the same calm, grounded presence that reminded me again and again that I was not crazy, that this pain was real, that my story was not invisible. She gave me a nod as I stepped down the marble stairs. No big smiles, no pity, just respect. It was all I needed. We drove away in silence for a while. Not the kind that stings, but the kind that holds space. My mind wandered to how it all began. A message from my son, a broken shoulder, a slap, soup poured over my head. A woman left bleeding behind a closed guest bedroom door. That was the version of me they wanted to forget. And for a while I almost let them. But now that version was buried deep in the dust, and I was standing. Weeks passed. The trust fund paperwork for the foundation was finalized. The ranch would be managed under the new non-profit. Scholarships would be awarded to women over 50, women who had lost everything, jobs, spouses, dignity, but not hope. That would be the seed. I named the program quietly after my own mother, who never had the chance to speak up for herself. The media coverage came, but I gave no interviews. Let them speculate. Let them wonder what could make a 71-year-old woman give away millions in silence. I had no intention to explain myself. That was my final act of power. One morning I received a letter, handwritten, neat, from someone named Elise, a woman in Montana who had read about the foundation. She was 63, recently divorced, said she hadn't spoken to her children in 3 years, but that now, maybe she could find her way again. She ended with, "Thank you for reminding me that I'm not worthless just because I turned grey." I cried when I finished reading it, not out of sorrow, but out of something deeper. A sense that everything I lost, every scar, every humiliation, had been repurposed, given meaning, given direction. A few weeks later, I stood by the lake house, the one I almost sold in panic, the one that held my husband's rocking chair, still creaking in the evening breeze. I sat down in it with a cup of black coffee and looked out at the water. No more legal papers, no more threats, just the hum of insects and the reflection of the sky in motion. There were moments when I missed who I used to be, the mother who cooked every holiday meal, the wife who never asked for much, the grandmother who wanted nothing more than to see her family smile. That woman was still inside me, but she had made room for someone else now, someone who knew how to say no, how to protect herself. One afternoon, Martina came by. She brought fresh tomatoes from her garden, and we sat on the back porch, laughing about a deer that kept chewing on her rosemary bush. No drama, no weight, just life. As the sun set behind the hills, I thought of Brendan. I had not heard from him since the day in court. I doubted I ever would. Maybe one day he would understand. Maybe not. That wasn't mine to carry anymore. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind pick up. My body still ached in places. My heart still had tender parts. But I was no longer broken. I was simply living, on my terms. And that was enough. If you're still here with me, thank you for listening. Maybe you've known what it feels like to be erased. Maybe you've been told that your pain was inconvenient. But I hope this story reminds you that silence does not mean weakness, that boundaries are not cruelty, and that reclaiming your worth, no matter how late, is not only possible, it's powerful. If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear your voice in the comments. You are not alone. Not now. Not ever.